Hello, welcome to Romero Threads on YouTube. My name is Ever Romero, and in today's video, I am going to give you 3 of the most important stitches in machine embroidery. We are also going to analyze these stitches and check out all the different purposes and different functions that each of these stitches give us as embroiderers. Let's go ahead, let's start with stitch number 1, which is the most important stitch of them all. Actually, every other stitch derives from this stitch here. So number 1 is our running stitch, and our running stitch can also be called different names also. Okay, so the running stitch can be called the walking stitch, placement stitch, cut stitch, travel stitch. Okay, the purpose of this stitch here is pretty much going from one side to another. Okay, so you are traveling from, let's say, point A, and it wants to get over here to point B, so it's going to follow a path. Okay, so whatever path you give it in your software, it's going to connect it through stitches. Our running stitch is determined by the length from stitch to stitch. Okay, you might require a smaller length in a more detailed type work. For example, if you're doing a circle, okay, if you're doing a perfect circle, you might want to include a lot of short stitches to get that perfect circle. All right, because what it is pretty much straight lines from point to point. Okay, so in order to get that perfect circle, you need to include more points. The least points that you provide, the least detailed your work will be. Okay, so if you're doing a circle and you're doing only 8 points, line, line, line. Okay, all right, so the more stitches that you have, the more detailed you can get. Now, the drawback of making small stitches is you can start introducing thread breaks. Walking stitch and travel stitch is pretty much, hey, I want to send this stitch. I don't want to introduce a cut, but I want to move my needle a specific location. Okay, in that situation, you're just traveling around your design to get where you got to go. Okay, placement stitch and cut stitch, those are found during applique type work. Every other stitch is a combination of the running stitch. So when we start introducing new stitches, okay, it all comes from this idea of we're going a distance, a length from a stitch to the next stitch. Some of the obstacles we want to kind of look out for with our running stitch is too many short stitches. Too many short stitches can start introducing a lot of heat, a lot of friction, since our stitches are so close together. All right, we might start receiving thread breaks at that point. Okay, so if there's a certain area that you notice that you're constantly getting thread breaks in, okay, take a look at any of your short stitches. Also, with some of our travel stitches, if they become too long, okay, now those long stitches become a little loose. Okay, and now you can introduce snagging. All right, snagging is just loose thread that could kind of hook up to anything that's kind of gets in contact with this thread. Okay, so in order to prevent snagging or any loose threads, you want to make sure the length of your running stitch is not too long. So this one here, once again, your most important stitch of them all. Every other stitch is a combination of the running stitch. Okay, so with that being said, let's go with stitch number 2. Okay, your second most important stitch is number 2, your satin stitch, also known as steel stitch, column stitch. It's kind of in the same family also as the zigzag stitch. It has its same characteristics as a satin stitch, as a zigzag stitch. Okay, so we could definitely put it in this department here. Now, let's talk about, this is my favorite stitch. All right, this is, it's giving you boldness. If you need boldness in your design, you're definitely going with the satin stitch. That's why maybe 99% of your text is always satin stitch, okay? Because it gives it a nice, clean, bold look. Satin stitch is pretty much going from one side Okay, to another side. Let's give our drawing here some definitions. So in order to describe our sand stitch, okay, it all revolves around this distance here. These distance here, these are your densities. The distance from this stitch here and whatever is on top or down below, the smaller the density, okay, the smaller the density, the closer these stitches will be. All right, so let's say for text, usually for text, your density, you're looking at a 0.38 millimeter. Okay, that's kind of like your default distance of density. Okay, usually you can't go wrong with a 0.38. Okay, of course, every now and then you gotta adjust it. Okay, depending on what you're designing, what's the size of whatever you're designing. Okay, but usually text, it's usually measured at 0.38 meters. If you're doing 3D puff, now you're dropping that density. You want this distance to be smaller, okay, just in order to cover that foam. Now you're looking at 18 millimeters, okay? So that's almost half that distance, all right? That's just to give you ballpark numbers, kind of let you know the difference of density that's going on here in the sand stitch. All right, same thing with zigzag stitch. Now when you're talking about a zigzag stitch, now you're going to open up the density with a zigzag stitch. Okay, so now let's say you open it up at a 0.75. All right, so these are just ballpark numbers. Of course, with experimentation and sampling, okay, you're always adjusting your density. Sometimes if you feel like you're getting too much thread on something very light, like on a light garment, you might want to raise up that density. Now, very important with the sand stitch is your limitations. It cannot pass a certain distance or else it starts looking very, very loose and you start losing quality. Usually machines will limit you at 12 millimeters. I kind of limit it, let's say 9 to 10 millimeters. Okay, from your distance. Now you're talking about from here to here now. Minimum, you don't want it to be too small where your distance is becoming too short, or else we start introducing short stitches. I would say you want to stay minimum, let's say 4 or 5 millimeters as a minimum. Okay, of course you could go a little lower. Okay, once you start reaching here 0.45, maybe 0.5. Okay, it's kind of like red light. Hey, you're starting to introduce these small stitches. Of course, with experimentation, some designs accept small stitches like that. Okay, so of course there's always exceptions to everything, but just as a general rule. Now, keynote here is once you start getting into these longer maximum lengths, now you have to start introducing more underlay. Okay, because now your threads on top, they're starting to become loose. So by putting a nice underlay, okay, you can tighten up those stitches a tad bit. All right, same thing with the minimum. Once you start bringing in very small stitches, now you want to eliminate underlays. Okay, at the very minimum, you put in a center run. Once you get to the minimum of the stitches. Okay, let's talk about stitch number 3, which is our tatami stitch. Tatami stitch, AKA, of course, they always have AKAs. Okay, we have our fill stitch. So this stitch here, the reason why it's so important now is because now we want to cover space. Now we have to start introducing this stitch. So, okay, let's say we want to cover this box here. All right, instead of going straight, we use it when we have to cover big spaces. All right, so especially for patches, when you want to build the base, you're definitely going to use the tatami stitch. All right, so tatami stitch here, and let me show you an example of us working the whole 3 stitches running stitch, tatami stitch, sand stitch. Here's a sample of a patch which starts with a tatami stitch to cover the entire base, followed by a sand stitch as the border. Then we use sand stitches and travel stitches to make our wings all in one stitch. And our text is finalized with thin sand stitches. This is the final product, and as you can see, the details came out great. Thank you for stopping by. Hit the like, subscribe, and all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.